everyone. I'm here to welcome my darling friend, colleague, and rock star choreographer, filmmaker, dancer, producer, content maker, Instagram star, darling of the press. Am I embarrassing you enough? This is Jacob Jonas, everyone, and I'm so happy to welcome you today to Flip the Script. This is our first special YouTube version via Zoom. So we're so happy to have you this way. And for folks out there who don't know me, I'm Achinta McDaniel, the founder and artistic director of Blue13. Hi, Jacob. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
It's so much fun when you interview friends, like in an official capacity, because you sort of have to go down the rabbit hole of let me read your bio again. Let me look at what you've done. Even though I know what you've been doing and we've known each other for so many years, it's just exciting to kind of be like, oh yeah, wait a minute, that's my friend, but I'm so just impressed and proud of you. You've made such a great name for yourself, not just in LA, but nationally and even internationally with your company. And I'm just going to embarrass you with tiny bits of your bio. Let's see, you got your start dancing with growing up in LA and in Venice, right at the boardwalk, at the pier with the Calypso tumblers. You were at Beverly Hills High School, which is where I met you when you did a Bollywood Bhangra dance number with me. Then you also studied more sort of codified ballet and jazz, etc. at M&R Dance Factory in Brentwood. That's where you met your partner, business partner, and romantic partner, Joe Wilson, who I know and love, who share the same birthday. So my question about all of that, and correct me if I missed anything, but how did all of those converge to kind of give voice and inspiration to your early works as a professional performer, and as a choreographer?
Uh, it's funny because I was first inspired to dance in Venice because I was craving some kind of belonging and familial part of, uh, yeah, just like to belong to a group and to belong to something much greater than what I was a part of at school. I never really felt like I belonged at school, and socially there was a lot of kind of behaviors, especially growing up in LA, that I just didn't really align with. And so when I started street performing, I felt very accepted and a part of a group and a family. And actually, the first time I ever learned choreography was with you.
Oh
um,
my God.
when I was a freshman in high school. You taught the group number, and that was the first time I actually ended up learning like a 5, 6, 7, 8. I'd learned ballet and I'd learned other forms of dance, but like trying to pick up a dance of choreography was the first time with you. So that was really exciting.
I love that.
But I think, yeah, just geographically growing up in the city and being surrounded by the Hollywood industry and being around, it's hard to catch kind of what what you can get from other people. And I think the thing that's inspired me most and shaped me most is kind of being around authentic people
Hmm.
that are really passionate about what they do. And I think that shaped me a lot.
I love that. When I know, let's see, what did we do? I think we did a little project that you were you even finished with high school? I don't remember when you were doing some of the first commercial stuff on TV, some projects with wasn't there a Paula Abdul show? Am I
Yeah.
wrong in selective memory? That's how it started, didn't it?
You're right. So Jill and I, so my partner Jill, we met at a competitive dance studio, MNR, and I started teaching dance, break dancing, acrobatics, and street dance there, uh, and and also was learning competitive dance. And that was my first exposure to it. It was very odd because as a street performer, you kind of train all day and you make money dancing, and this
Right.
was the first experience I was actually paying to dance, which was a very weird
You
thing
signed
to go
that
from.
phrase
But
pay to play for the first time.
exactly. But I was exposed to more classical styles of dance through that, and that's how I met Jill. And yeah, that's right. We were asked by Paul Abdul's team. They were developing a show um, that we ended up being on, and that kind of started a bit of a journey for us. I was actually planning to go to Montreal that year and try to start diving into the circus community and go to school up in Montreal. And then that Paul Abdul show happened, and I ended up staying in LA.
Yeah, and that sort of changed the trajectory for you and Jill too, because then you were really collaborating on a different kind of level and scale without teachers and people telling you kind of what to do, right?
It's when we started dating as well. So
Yeah, I
we
remember.
were just we were just kind of friends, and it's actually today is Wednesday. This coming weekend on Halloween will have been 10 years from that audition. We auditioned on 10 years ago on Halloween, and
Are you serious?
we started dating on the 2nd. So this November
Oh,
2nd, we're celebrating 10 years together. So
that's amazing. Congratulations.
it's funny because I
Even
haven't talked
longer. We didn't plan this. Like, I didn't know this.
and I haven't talked about that show in probably 5 years. So it's nice
I
that you
love
brought
it.
it back up.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I have more for you. And then, how is your, so I consider you, and yeah, I consider you an author, right? So how's your authorship as an artist evolved to these incredible hyphenate incarnations, right? Choreographer, producer, filmmaker, all of these things. And if I'm missing one, say I'm a teacher, um, how has it sort of evolved that way, or just has it been organic? And then, or anything you want to talk about that, and also in which of these roles, this is really for me when I um, teach or perform or this or that. One of the places where I feel most at home and in my own skin and most mindful, and I could just not think of anything else in the world, is when I'm on stage with like, it could be 100 people or 5,000 people that I'm teaching, and all hands up together, and there's live music, and we're vibing, and the whole group is together. If I scratch my nose, they scratch my nose. Like that. That to me feels where I'm most in my own skin. Which one of these sort of hyphenate roles or any of these author roles do you feel most at home in your own skin, and how did that sort of come about?
I think I think the question was about being an author. They all play a very interesting role for me because I approach them all very similarly, just kind of through different mediums. I think choreographically, it hasn't really been until the past year or so where I felt consistent in terms of approaching a process and knowing kind of how to be consistent with different ideas or processes. And so I feel like I've finally gotten to a place where I know how to do it without questioning myself.
Mm-hmm.
But photography was really the first medium where I felt like I was in a pocket where I can show up, understand light, understand conditions and weather, and understand kind of my communication with the dancers or the artists that I was working with until it felt um, interesting. But I think, yeah, over the past like year or so, I've really started to understand the energy. And I think also as a curator, like working with and producing other people where I'm not necessarily have a creative hand, but I'm just facilitating people to be involved.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm just the thing that's similar is just looking for an energy, looking for something that I was then once inspired when I saw a group of street performers. It's like it's that energy that inspires people, lifts them up, and kind of takes them out of their day-to-day routine. And I think it's the power of creativity and the power of the arts is just feeling feeling kind of free in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought up the photography piece as sort of being the first maybe foray, um, because your work is so, with your company, is so visual, right? It's so highly visual. It seems really rooted in a love for visual art, for camera, like for shape, and for lack of a better word, for poses or shapes for the audience to really. So I love what you're saying of like to give that energy, in meaning, are you really thinking about not necessarily like what the demographics of your audience are, but are you really thinking about how is this going to be consumed? What kind of stamp is this going to make? Are you thinking of that in your process, or tell us more about your process?
Yeah, you're right. I am very visual, and I think that's um, I'm not I've developed a vocabulary for sure from the different influences I've had through different choreographers I've worked with and processes I've been involved in and things I've studied. But I think I always approach something with a title or a visual or a concept. I kind of look like movement, like a scriptwriter would, just as words.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not as interested in words. I'm kind of more interested in like what is the overall narrative or what is the overall story I'm trying to tell or thing I'm trying to capture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm less interested of like the actual movements and more interested in the overall concepts. And I think that's what keeps me excited to make new work. Um, yeah. And what was it? This. The second
No, I
part.
was just asking, yeah, just the process. Like, are you then, so with this sort of narrative mood or structure, are you then disseminating that to your collaborators or let's say you're in the studio,
Yeah.
or now in the parking lot, right? So how are you relaying that from the jump, like when you first start versus like through the process to the final?
I think there's so much that goes into it for me individually, like just in terms of research, be it a month, a year, 5 years of just like researching what I want to do so that by the time I get into the space with the paint, I kind of already see it on the canvas. And it's more than just psychology and working with those individuals and trying to bring out the best of their potential. It's kind of like now I'm a coach and I'm not the artist anymore. The art really comes in the research and
Hmm.
the planning. And then once I get into the studio, it's more just trying to make sure people are on time and bringing the best out of each other and out of the process. And I feel like at that point, I know exactly what I'm trying to do.
Right. And then is that research process a solitary one?
No, it's so different every time.
What's an example?
If it ever becomes consistent is when I feel like it's now a business and it's not
Hmm.
a creative practice anymore. And I think the same is true with actually doing the business of what we do administratively as well as like trying to continue to make it feel non like traditional or abstract. An example, there's two pieces I recently did 2 years ago or a year ago. One was called There's Been a Study and one was called Crash. Both very opposite in terms of their themes. One had a strong social message and the other was more abstract. One was inspired by nature. Crash was about the ocean and waves crashing on the beach. So I actually just spent a lot of time in the ocean and was inspired by the ocean and kind of trying to create the same physical movements on bodies as nature does, where there's nothing consistent and kind of approaching it that way. And there's been a study was the complete opposite process where I wrote a script and I worked for like probably 3 or 4 years developing the concept, the scenes, the lighting, everything, the costumes, so that by the time I got in the studio, I had an idea of the structure, the scenes, and then it was just really developing the vocabulary on my body and then trying to workshop as much as possible with the dancers and see what could they also bring from their own personal experiences of being in school.
Hmm.
The whole thing was about kind of not being accepted in school and how creativity isn't really um, how the education system tries to make everyone think the same. And the whole
Hmm.
piece was to be against to that.
Yeah. I hear that, and that's fascinating about the process, and I love that it's so different every time. Um, it sounds like the belonging factor started your work and consistently arrives there. Would you find that to be true? The sort of like search for othering, or the idea of othering and identity and belonging. Do you find that to be a big part?
I think all of us do. I think even you initiating this conversation is so much of like artists wanting to feel a sense of community. And I think I always wanted to feel a sense of family. My parents are divorced. I never saw them love each other. I never saw them talk positively about each other. In school, there's always just been a lot of um, like weird just moments socially. And I think building a company for me has been really about creating a family. Like if we get to make great pieces, great. If we get to make money, great. But it's really just a place for like a lot of our dancers don't have the best relationships with their parents, or their families live in other parts of the country or the world, or it really is a place for them to always come and know that they're going to be loved. It's not hierarchical. No one's competing with each other. It is a space. And I think what both of us have done in the city, and I think what we continue to do, is create that same space in this medium, is to just try to support one another and create that sense of family and belonging for sure.
I love that. I hear beeping in the background. This is us in LA, everybody. Not from my side, probably. Yeah, completely. And with this sort of initiative, with these flip the scripts, we're talking to people from all different kinds of, from boards on dance companies to actual dancers perform. I mean, everyone. So it's really interesting. to keep that sense of community at the same time and not to feel competitive with each other, which often it happens all over the dance world. But I think there's something particular about LA. Do you find that too? About because there's I don't know. We've talked about it just personally off camera, but about the sort of this idea that there's a lack of funding for LA companies that pits us against each other, or the idea that we have to compete all for this small pot of cash. Um, I don't know if you found that, or how do you just get over that kind of idea, or same thing with the construct of commercial versus concert and
Yeah,
streaming.
I think if I think it all goes back to a very similar thing. I think just the business model of arts organizations in this country in general are just like, it's not a smart business model. Like, to be a nonprofit organization and depend on wealthy people to support your life and your fulfillment and the success of your business, I don't think is sustainable. I think this is a much deeper conversation, but I think if you go to school to be pre-law, you become a lawyer. If you go to school to be pre-med, you become a doctor. If you go to school to be a pre-artist, the best job you can really have is to then become a university teacher. And so it's kind of a flawed system in that regard, financially. But I think we all need to rethink what that business model is. And I think when you think about things financially, if you do really well in film, you'll make a lot of money as a director, as an actor. If you do really well in music, or at least before a pandemic, by touring and doing other things, there are some dancers that make good money, but but I think the lack of financial support has caused people to try to find value in other places because they're not receiving it through money, they're receiving it through other places. And then, so when you're not receiving any kind of support, be it financial support, press, acknowledgement, which we all strive to do, and it goes as deep as just having our parents trust the fact that this is what we wanted to do and we're going to do well at it. I think that's what we're all wanting, is just our parents to be proud of us for saying we want to be an artist. And I think that is so heavily rooted that because a lot of us aren't seeing that financially, we need to go out of our ways to do it in other capacities. And unfortunately, some people just do it by having to say what they do is good. And I don't think that's the best or healthiest way, but I think that's why sometimes there can become a competitive environment. And I don't think it's necessary. I think we can all still find value in ourselves and each other by just supporting each other without having it to be, but I think financially we're gonna flip the script in the next 10 to 20 years, hopefully, so that we don't have to depend so heavily on donors.
Yeah, I agree. And speaking of just sort of press and other people's perceptions, my last two were over time. My last thing is like, what are hits or misses? And this is for other artists. Maybe how do you deal with hits or misses in your career? Meaning things that you might cringe from that you've done, or that you celebrate, or things that how do you let that sort of affect you moving forward, staying in your skin and continuing working if there've been like a negative review or a positive review for that fact? Fact, any advice for younger or not younger?
Absolutely. I think, my mentor is Donald Byrd, who's been very close to me and for a long time. And, I got one of my first reviews, was in the New York Times, and God knows how they did the piece, but they just ripped the show to shreds. And it was like one of my first shows, and I saw him the next day, and he was like, Jacob, no matter how long you do this for your whole life, if you get a positive review or a negative review, you have to take the same personally. You can't just take the bad reviews personally and not the good ones. And still to this day, when you get a review and it's like 99% good and there's like one sentence that's bad, that's the only thing you think about for like 5 years. But I think if I look at it like photography, or I look at it kind of like Instagram, where it's like, if you go on and you see one photo, that's great, that's cool. Or like a musician, you hear one song, that's great. But then when you look at the album, or you look at the portfolio, or you look at the body of work over the many years, I think that's what all of us are kind of doing. Like, we're not we're not looking for the one hit. We're looking at this for the long run. And so, of course, you're going to have bad works. I think Paul Taylor made over like 140 works. I'm sure not all of them were great. And so I'm down to fail. And,
Yeah.
and also the result might be a failure, but what you learned through that process in making it, or the people you met through that time, like I think there's always like a win in learning somehow. So,
Yeah.
but press, I think, is just part of it, and thank God for them, whether good or bad, because they're continuing to help us be visible in a capacity. So,
Right.
and also the journalists want to be seen as well. So it's their way of kind of sharing their own point of view. It's not the only point of view. Normally, in any theater we go to, there's at least however many seats, so it's just one seat that's off publishing it. But
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And then my last question for you before things get flippy, because I can feel the rocking, is just how, or any of these, I know you're doing that awesome initiative, a digital dance, or what do you envision, or are you doing during to sort of weather the rest of this pandemic in your work, or which way do you see us moving forward as artists to weather the pandemic, since it's going to be a while, and also in like a post-vaccine world? How do you see things changing?
That's a great question. I'm producing like a film series now, and it'll be released probably in December, January, like kind of announcing it and what it's been. But I've been working on it for about like 5 or 6 months now. But the impetus for doing that was through a couple of conversations earlier on in the pandemic with different donors and people in different organizations, leadership in different organizations, kind of saying, how do we keep dance visible during this time when the curtain's down? Um, and I think that's been a big mission of ours prior to the pandemic, was digital visibility online, and also building community. So it's not just making my work, but it's also how do you raise the bar for dance as a medium. And so that's something that's always stayed true to my work. And so that's a lot of what our initiative has been through the different things that we've been doing during this pandemic. But I think yeah, we just all got to stay behind each other and support each other and keep staying creative and thinking non-traditionally, because, you have to break rules essentially to become an artist and think differently. So why not use this time to take that same idea and keep making work,
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, great. Oh gosh, Jacob, you know that? Why is your screen not moving? I feel something happening and it's flipping. I wish we could do it so that when we flip the script, we would be in each other's outfits, but
That'd be cool. I got
we'll have that for
maroon.
next time.
I got
Did
maroon.
everybody for you, and if you don't know what that means, it means for flip the script, I interview somebody, and then they interview me or anyone from the community, and so now I'm going to change my hat to the interviewee.
Cool. Well, I'll start similarly. I know you well, but it was interesting to go on your website and kind of read how you and your organization communicated your company online. And I was reading the bio, and there were 3 words that really stuck out to me within the same sentence, and they were rebellious, unconventional, and architect. And those are 3 things I really resonate with deeply. And so it'd be cool to just talk about each word for a second and
Sure.
kind of dive deeply. I think rebellious to me speaks so true to who you are, just in terms of your energy, and even separate from your work, what you do to people when you meet them and what you do to audiences. I think you do try to challenge the norm of what's normal and just how people feel. So it'd be cool if you just talked about what it means to be rebellious.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also just growing up as first generation born in this country. My parents, big immigrants from India, is the idea of like the notion of the good Indian girl growing up in like a predominantly white, well to do Cleveland suburb, right? And really um, being the good Indian girl, not being too Americanized. And anyone out there is like children of immigrants. We throw that term around all the time. That's what we hear growing up. So it's both. It's like constantly walking this fine line of trying to be who you are and being pulled apart from 2 things, like a very white um, uh, center of like being normal and trying to be white basically when you're little and you're growing up and everyone else looks is white around you. Maybe there's 2 people that are of color in your school, and then even in dance, etc., right? Like in every facet of your life. So trying to kind of assimilate and be a part of that and hide your brownness or my brownness, I'll speak for myself, was a bit, was like growing up. And then also trying to be as good as possible, straight A's. Yeah, and then as I grew up, I started being like, fuck no, I don't want to do this anymore. And that's like that we all kind of do angsty freshman year teenagers moving forward. That's also the same time that I collided with choreography, right? So I'd been growing up dancing, ballet, et cetera, et cetera. And then modern became my love, and I was introduced to it when I was 14. So that collided at the same time, the sort of rebellion of modern and postmodernism and dance and learning to study that and being able to take the reins finally and choreograph and tell people what to do. It sort of opened this Pandora's box for me. And my parents were not excited about that because they were happy to support me as a dancer, but all of a sudden it was all sorts of rebellion, combat boots and black leather jackets and misfits and punk rock, right? So it was a little bit of culture shock for them that way, much less dating boys and doing things that I'm not allowed to do, having to lie and sneak around. That was a big part of growing up when you're constantly like torn to two sides, and you're constantly hiding little parts of your character and who you are from people that are important to you and that you love, and like you're saying that we want to make proud of us, that having that rebelliousness happen like all at once and sort of really just kind of changed who I was and started to make me learn about what identity was. I didn't know that then, right? So then years later, just continuing to dance and move and still have to get straight A's, otherwise I wasn't allowed to do this, or I was going to be grounded all the way through junior of high school. Trying to just to do the best and overachieve, right? Like academically, to feel accepted and belonging in my kind of small school, but also realize the what the fuck, I'm not gonna go to cotillion. Like that's not who I am. I'm not invited to
Right.
the ball, you know? So having that othering and then trying to like grab it and really like put it on as a costume choice to be like, okay, I'm not you. Now let me show you how different I am.
Right.
You know? And that really kind of shaped really terrible incarnations of performing and creating work as a 14-year-old all the way through now. And then the way rebellion kind of has gone on into like adulthood, and the company is really about kind of both sides redefining the idea or trying to challenge the notion of the audience of like, what do you think of when you think of contemporary? What's the word that, what do you think of when you think of American dance? It's not me, right? Like it's usually like, you know, a white dance company on stage and a proscenium performance is usually when I ask that question to people, or even the idea, right? Like girl next door, all American, that whole thing, like really trying to challenge that notion. Um, and then just being, just constantly disrupting and being a troublemaker, right? So that to continue to interrogate as myself, my dancers, and for audiences, and even people who are coming to class thinking that they have to stand and be a certain way. I'm like, hey, talk to each other. How about that? You're not ignoring the people that you're sweating next to, right? So talking to each other, let people let their hair down and just be your truest kind of authentic self. That's a long answer, but that's part of the rebellion.
And you're saying when you talk to other people and you're talking about kind of traditional dance companies or American companies, who would you say are dance companies that you might have admired or looked up to, regardless of their kind of race or culture, or
Growing up,
yeah, or just
yeah,
people that you admired?
yeah, Ailey, yeah, which is different. Like that, I only was introduced to Ailey just going to Boston on a family trip when I was 14, and that was, see what I mean about like colliding all at the same time. That was
Yeah.
kind of cool. But before that, Graham, Twyla Tharp, Paul Taylor, um, Jose Limon, like these are the artists that we would love and revere,
It's
um,
awesome.
and would learn about to a degree, you know, but really sort of not realizing that contemporary meant and means is such a giant umbrella, right? Like you can be a contemporary artist from India, Slovakia, from Brazil, from, you know, and really pull in so many different forms, which we're starting to see and we have been seeing now. I
Yeah.
mean, for many years, but now for it to be, it's still. the fact that I still ask people that and I'm just investigating, not judging, and still the idea is like, oh, like a ballet, what's American dance? And people are still like, oh, a ballet company. Maybe contemporary is second, but they're not thinking, um, a company that pulls in rhythmic footwork of Kathak, you know,
Right.
that also is like trying to mess with the idea of what it is to be American. You know what I mean? Like still interrogating the idea of Americanness and equating it with whiteness is still such a big kind of roadblock, right? So even teaching,
Absolutely.
yeah, teaching at the university level, still when the freshmen come in, we start talking about these ideas. There's a lot of and these are students of the world in 2020. So
Absolutely. So then that kind of leads me to the next one, which would be unconventional. And you started that whole explanation by saying that you were first generation American. So I guess my first question in a series of a few under unconventional is, where are your parents from in India?
Oh, we're Punjabi, and religion-wise, my family is Sikh. Sikh is their religion, which is sort of a rebellious religion in India too, and a younger one. So my dad wears a turban. All the men in my family, not my brother, but a lot of the men in my family have long hair with a turban and a beard. We wear kada, which I still do. I'm more of a spiritual at large person, so I don't necessarily adhere to one religion, but that I grew up with that. And my dad was born in Agra as an Air Force brat. My grandfather flew in World War II. As an
Wow.
ally, crashed a plane, lost one of his teeth, broke his nose. He was a huge, oh my God, he's a big influence too, because he would have classical music, Indian and Western classical music, piping out of his room at all hours of the day and night. So that was just part of my psyche growing up. We grew up with my grandparents. And then my mom was born in Kanpur, which is in North India also. So
It's amazing. And and you grew up in Queens as well, which is also very
I was born at Long Island Jewish.
um and I guess it's interesting thinking about you growing up in a metropolitan city that supports dance, where dance is very um, present, and you kind of always being on this quest of understanding what is American dance. Whereas when I think about dance today growing up, I don't think about it being country based or even city based. I really just think about the artist and the artistic director and just try to understand what is their voice, what is their vision. So it's actually more international for me rather than American. That was something also I read in the bio as well, is like rethinking what is American dance today, um, which is very fascinating to me. And I know that you also went back to India, or went to India, and I'm sure that informed you a lot. Um, so a question I had in terms of unconventional is kind of, I wanted to dive into the relationship between music and physicality for a second, because I know performing some of your work earlier on and also now seeing some of your work, oftentimes you choose to use Indian music. And I wonder, thinking about Kathak and Bhangra and Bollywood vocabularies, you often complement it sonically with that same kind of music to go with it. And I wonder, is that something you feel like I wonder what the decision in that is, or why not juxtapose it to continue those same.
That's a great question. And we do and have I like to now not now, like for the past many years, play a lot with silence and different rhythmic structures. So Kathak is really that changed my world. Speaking about going to India, right? Like after NYU and then going on this sort of journey to India, learning Kathak really intensively. That changed my entire view. And rhythm had always been such an important part of me and my identity as a choreographer and dancer. But Kathak was changing. All of a sudden, you're speaking dance, which is the way which vibes with me so much. Like to not just always count, right? And to be like, you probably do this too, on the ka and the ha and the breath, right? And really using that breath rhythm. So counting suddenly not in 4/4 all the time, and they're like, okay, and then it's a 9 followed by a 16 and a 13. Achinta, got it? Here we go. And I was like, what? When I was learning Kathak in India, so that was amazing. and then just the roots of it being in storytelling. So not just rhythm, but rhythm and storytelling are really important, and that either mirrored or juxtaposed sonically, like you put it, is interesting. So a lot of times for Bollywood to be Bollywood, you're you're dancing usually to Bollywood music, meaning it's made in the film industry in India in Mumbai. Um, for more of the contemporary work that pulls in Kathak, we'll do like we just had um, a premiere called Terpsichore and Hindus the Wallace, and we have a commissioned piece by some really incredible bass player and a sarangi player and a violinist and a percussionist, three dhol players. Like these are all who were on stage essentially with us for the piece, and that was very. So we're still like hammering out rhythms with our feet, still employing mudras, but it's a contemporary work, and it might sound like okay, how is ta te ta ta te ta 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 te ha ha going with this bass and this violin riff over the top of it, but collaborating with the musicians has really created something really interesting. So I love to really fuck with what we're dancing to. It doesn't always have to be Indian at all.
Cool.
I love to dance to Indian music though because like I was saying about my grandfather, grew up with it.
Yeah.
Sometimes classical and sometimes more commercials.
So do you feel like, I mean, just while you speak and hearing the presence of how much India, both with your parents being from there and you going back there, has informed you so much, and thinking about so many artists that are, first generation American and their parents are from Mexico or from Africa or from St. Kitts, like my mentor is from, and just different parts of the world. It feels like in a way you almost answer the to me what you feel like was the problem in the beginning, where it's like when I think of American, I don't think of whiteness. I think of all these cultures and this like melting pot, and how where they kind of immigrated from, because all of us are essentially immigrants in a
Right.
certain capacity. I think even the idea of whiteness is so interesting to me because there's white Jews from Poland and from Russia. There's yeah, I'm very fascinated about where you're from rather than what you look like, and I think
Right.
that's what's so fascinating to me
Yeah,
is
totally agree. Not sorry to interrupt, but like but those things for me, and I think the closer you are in the how many generations have immigrated to the United States, the more you grapple with these things. Maybe I don't want to speak for anyone else, but that for me, Jacob, is my identity, and my identity like obviously speaks to the work.
totally.
So I always say this. People are probably so sick of me saying this, but like my identity is in the discomfort of that tightrope, is on eggshells. Like that's what my identity is.
Yeah.
It's this pull apart, this polarized feeling. That's who I am, which
And
is a
I
mess, but it has all that strength of it of answering. Yeah, like giving an answer to what is a problem. Um, it's not even about like you're you're wrong. I'm judging you. I'm just saying I want to go like this to your perceived notion of what you first maybe thought of. You
and
know,
I and I think that's what's so exciting too about specifically your work, again, both being someone at a very young age learning it and then also being able to be in the audience and watching it, is that when I travel, I'm less motivated to go to Main Street and get the best restaurant's meal, but meet the stranger at the bar and be invited back to their home and like really feel what their culture is. And
right?
you know, there's thinking about all the corners of the world. I think that's what you do when you go to see your work, is there's a sense of understanding what a home cooked meal is physically when you see your work, but
Yeah,
it's also very much like who is Achinta as an artist. And
right.
I think that's rare in experience. I think everyone kind of is born and they go through all their experiences, and if their work is done authentically, it's just the result of what they've experienced and what you grew up with, not seeing many people that look like you, and also growing up in a city where dance was white, and um, going back to India. And I think all these things have informed the stories and things you want to tell, which I think are so important to create a palette of different tastes and feelings, and all while telling you. I mean, one thing that I remember too is when I was at MNR, our modern teacher, one it was like one of the first classes I took there as well, and one of like our modern teachers was gone, and you had to substitute. And I'll never forget, you went from like the Bollywood Indian teacher to like throwing on some Radiohead, and you were just like going into it, and I'm like, damn, like she's not just a Bollywood teacher, like she's like a raw, like contemporary choreographer with no Indian vocabulary at all. And I'm like, Jesus. And it was so fascinating to me to see that side of you that I think was rooted in that rebelliousness of like, I don't care where I'm, like I'm like, this is where I'm at. And like, it was very interesting. I'll never forget that, because,
I love that.
and I wondered too, like kind of the pressures you faced as being one of the only people that looked like you growing up, and also what it was like to be Indian, and also just all the things that you had to fight against
Yeah.
from a vocabulary standpoint and from a cultural standpoint in the work that you make. It's almost like you feel like you have to introduce audiences so much to Indian culture, where it's like, I wonder if you made a work that didn't have any Indian culture vocabulary in it. It was like, what is it, just in terms of
Yeah.
feeling, and so not to say that we don't want to see that, because obviously it's so present in you, but it's almost like this fight that you've had to do for so long
Oh
to
my
just
God.
like,
Completely.
yeah,
That's really the crux of it, is the monolith, right? Being the monolith and representation of all things Indian or of the whole culture or the subcontinent, that multiplicity. Like I've done hundreds of classes and so many iterations of choreography that don't have a mudra or anything classical
yeah,
in them, right? Sure, it might just be part of my soul and how I move,
uh,
but it hasn't been. And I used to my growing up when I first was introduced to dance, it was yes a little bit at home learning Punjabi. My parents aren't dancers. It
uh,
was when I was 3 years old at the ballet bar. So like my original vocabulary is ballet and tap and jazz and modern hip hop. Like then learning just culturally and learning Bollywood and Bhangra and this and that. It wasn't codified yet. But yeah,
right.
there is that thing of like now I have to I love doing Bollywood and I love Kathak and I love all of these forms, but I feel also like talking about being in your own skin so at home and in my soul when I'm just riffing and it's pretty modern, just like you're saying. It's usually just like contemporary movement. Let's do it, and I don't have to answer to like being super Indian. And
Yeah,
so sometimes that's really disallowed. Like we want to book you at the Getty or whatever. No, I'm not throwing the Getty under the bus or wherever, but we want
because you represent this checkbox for us, and it's,
right,
yeah,
which is
which,
interesting. So like you don't want to denigrate that artistry, you know what I mean? But at the same time, you're like, I am allowed to have abstract ideas and work.
and I guess that's why I was so fascinated in talking about your relationship to dance and music sonically, because so much of what you do is percussive, and the way you communicate things isn't in counts, but it's in sounds and
Right.
rhythms. And I wonder, like, if you did, not to try to commission a new work, but like if you were to collaborate with a musician and not use colorful clothing or clothing that replicated Indian culture, but it was just like raw and Achinta and everything that you learned through your dance experience and what you had growing up, and that all attributed to that work, it almost feels like with that nonprofit idea and grant writing and all this shit, you have to like fit in this box. And I feel like, what is that story of like who you are, that you don't have to communicate these things, because of one reason or another, which isn't to say those things are bad, and they helped inform me even, learning from you. So it's just an interesting thought, and I wonder how many people that don't, back to that whole theme of belonging. I didn't feel belonging for one reason or another. You didn't feel belonging from one reason or another. I think most artists don't, and that's why they become artists. But I wonder how many people from a cultural sense don't feel a sense of belonging in America because of whiteness or because of any other reason, and they feel so forced to continue the legacy of their culture,
Yeah.
um, for whatever
Pressure of
reason.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah. And not just for your parents or whatever it is, but just like you're saying, a funder or a checkbox, sometimes like with Paul at the Wallace, he's just such an incredible person to say, yeah, go like run with it. But we're us also being like smart, kind of smart with the audience. Meaning, let me start with this Bollywood number. I'm gonna lull you then into here, and then I'm gonna take you where the entire second act, Jacob, that whole piece, that sort of opus,
Yeah,
is speaking to all the things that we're talking about, and
it's cool.
it's all violin, it's all strings and percussion, and there's nothing Indian sonically except for the sarangi, which people don't recognize, and it's like an identity journey, and it's about the diaspora. So I'm not alone in that. It's just like the sort of blind spot, I think, for humans on the planet of what the diaspora is and what um, our cultural sort of creations can be. Like just ignoring the fact that the diaspora has works that can be really are beautiful and abstract and are filled with multiplicity. And then it doesn't have to be classical Indian checkbox, right? Where like we hear that a lot. Oh yeah, I checked my box that you're not. We have classical Indian dance, and that's the high point of everything Indian. Anything else doesn't exist,
Right.
right? So it's I'm not the only one that's grappling
And
with
it seems like that's your way of defining architecture and kind of how you
it.
define things physically with architecture.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, obviously, there's a lot more thoughts to think about. I could keep doing this for a while, but it's nice to have the 15-minute.
I know. With the 15-minute mark, I think we went over a little bit, but there's
I'm
so much
sure.
to say and do.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think you're just to circle it back to you, just speaking of architecture quickly, is just your the sort of acrobatics of it, right? And the use of negative space and the photos and how you see that really come to life with your work on stage or in COVID in outdoor spaces or collaborating with other people. I really see architecture so much in there. I was talking to a friend about it too, who does a lot of filmmaking and photography and is really used to be an architect. And he was like, "That's what you all are. You choreographers. You're just architects." And I always say, "I'm like, the architecture of this, something as simple as this, right,
Hmm.
or like whatever this is like your home base, and building the architecture on top of that, and then soul wise, right, and then with what you do visually,
Yeah.
building that architecture, I think is so incredibly important for the people that you're like leaving these stamps on, whether it's the dancers or the audience. These are things that they won't forget. The things that
Absolutely.
you're doing, right, that are sort of burnt into their memories now and really affect them moving forward. So
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Well, I had 6 other questions that I wrote down, but I'm happy that we.
we'll do another one. We'll do a little play date.
Very cool.
Thank you, Jacob Jonas, for joining me as my friend and colleague and
Thank you.
flipping the script with me today. Thank you all. Please go check out Jacob Jonas, the company. You probably already follow them all over Instagram. But see them on YouTube and just follow all their work. They're doing great stuff. We can't wait to see the film
Thank you.
this winter. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well,
Everyone.
thanks.